Welcome to BookBound Audio. Immerse yourself in riveting tales, where every word pulls you deeper into worlds of mystery, suspense, and unforgettable characters. Today, we present Death in the Crossfire, a gripping murder mystery thriller set against the turbulence of the 1960s civil rights movement. Join us as we unravel a story of betrayal, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Let's dive in. Your journey into the shadows begins now. The air in Jackson that day carried a peculiar weight, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I stood by Elliot's side, the ground beneath my feet reverberating faintly with chants and footsteps from the nearby march. The demonstrators' voices rose, passionate and raw, cutting through the dense atmosphere with a palpable urgency. Their cries for justice echoed down the streets, unyielding despite the presence of uniformed figures with grim expressions shadowing their movements. Elliot, as usual, had an aura of unwavering focus. He wore his trench coat, a worn, grey thing that somehow added to the sharpness of his presence, and surveyed the alley where Elijah Carter's body had been discovered. I could tell he was already piecing together fragments of a puzzle invisible to me. It was his way, that quiet intellect flickering behind dark eyes, measuring and calculating the worth of every clue. I glanced down at Elijah's body, now covered with a thin white sheet provided by a patrolman standing nearby. The sight still unnerved me, though I had been around death before. This was different. The man lying cold beneath the sheet wasn't just a casualty, he was a symbol, a leader whose charisma could ignite hope and fury in equal measure. Yet here he was, lifeless and abandoned in a grim alley that reeked of damp brick and trash, a cruel backdrop for such a bold life extinguished. "Bullet wound," Elliot murmured, kneeling beside the body without so much as flinching. His voice was firm yet low, its edges refined by years of observation. He motioned toward the chest area, pointing with his pen. "Clean entry. No residue around the collar, definitely not close range." "Which rules out the shooter being part of the crowd," I said, leaning slightly to look closer. Speaking helped fend off the creeping nausea in my stomach. Elliot only nodded, scanning the scene with an eye trained to see past the obvious. The alley was narrow, hemmed in by buildings that hadn't seen care in decades. Overhead, a tangle of wires and fire escapes stretched like skeletal limbs, casting distorted shadows in the late afternoon sunlight. Pieces of shattered glass crunched beneath our shoes as Elliot rose to his feet, looking toward the back of the alley where the darkness pooled thicker than the rest. "Anything from the witnesses yet?" he asked. I glanced toward the small gathering of onlookers at the mouth of the alley, many of them reluctant to make eye contact with us. A few activists had strayed from the march, their faces etched with worry and quiet anger. Among them, I noticed a woman clutching a sign that read, "Equality for all star." Her knuckles were white against the wooden handle, her lip trembling as she whispered to another. "Not much," I admitted. "People are afraid to talk." Most didn't even notice Elijah was gone until the commotion started. Elliot's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Fear skews memory. We need them calm before anything useful surfaces." He motioned toward the patrolman standing awkwardly at a distance, eyeing us nervously. "Officer, any luck with crowd control?" The young man hesitated before responding, wiping his brow despite the crispness of the day. "Not much, sir. Most folks ain't willing to stick around for questions. Can't say I blame them. Crowds like this, tensions run high." Elliot nodded curtly and turned back to me. "Let's start with the environment. Find anything unusual near the body?" I shook my head, although something about the scene nagged at me. The alley was deserted in the usual sense, trash bins, broken bottles, remnants of old newspapers flapping in the faint breeze. But there was an eerie stillness that prickled my skin, something that felt hollow, even for a space like this. "Give me the details again," Elliot prompted, tapping his notebook. Elijah was last seen leading the march near the intersection. Witnesses say he split off briefly, maybe to get water or take a breather. A commotion started about 10 minutes later, and the body was found here. Elliot's gaze swept over the alley once more, lingering on the far end where the shadows seemed heavier. "Why this location?" he mused aloud. "It's too out of the way for a spontaneous act." His observation made sense, as it always did. The alley wasn't visible from the main protest route. It was tucked behind a series of buildings whose faded facades barely hinted at life within. The kind of place where one could disappear unnoticed, if they weren't careful. I followed him toward the far end, my footsteps cautious despite the daylight. He examined the ground, his sharp eyes catching details I missed, scuff marks along the bricks, a broken clasp glinting faintly among the debris. He bent to retrieve it, holding it toward the light. "Necklace clasp," he muttered. "Silver. Could be a personal item." I frowned. Elijah wore a medallion during the march. "Think it was his?" "Possible," Elliot said, pocketing the find. But the chain wasn't around his neck when we arrived. Either it broke during the altercation or someone took it. The thought sent a shiver through me. Why would someone take such an item unless it had meaning, or unless they didn't want it to be found? Our search brought us to a dead end where the alley met the rear of an abandoned building. Elliot examined the door carefully, brushing his fingers against the rusted handle. "Locked," he murmured, checking the hinges. "Hasn't been used in months, possibly years. No recent disturbances." A sudden sound from the mouth of the alley brought our attention snapping back. The patrolman was gesturing for us to join him, his face pale despite the sunlight spilling across the scene. When we approached, he pointed toward a young woman clutching her coat tightly around her shoulders. Her gaze darted between us and the crowd as if debating whether she could trust us. "I think she might have seen something," the officer explained. Elliot took the lead, his voice steady but softened, a tone reserved for fragile witnesses. My name is Elliot Brooks. I'm helping investigate what happened here today. Anything you can share could be important." The woman's fingers trembled against the fabric of her coat. Her eyes flickered toward me briefly before she spoke, her voice barely audible. I saw him leave the march. He went toward the alley alone." "Was anyone following him?" Elliot pressed. She hesitated, a small furrow forming between her brows. "Maybe there was someone. A man. Didn't look familiar. Can you describe him?" Her hesitation deepened, and I noticed her glance toward the nearby crowd, her lips pressing into a thin line. I stepped forward gently. "I know this isn't easy, but whatever you tell us stays between us. We're just trying to find the truth." The reassurance seemed to steady her. He was wearing a hat. Dark clothes. I think he went into the alley before Elijah." Elliot nodded thoughtfully, his expression unreadable as he jotted down notes. "Thank you," he said simply. "You've been very helpful." As we retreated from the witness, the weight of her words settled over me. A man in dark clothes, moving into the alley before Elijah, a shadow amid the chaos, invisible until it was too late. "This isn't adding up," Elliot said under his breath as we returned to the body. "We're dealing with someone who knows how to move unnoticed, to strike when no one's watching. I stared down at Elijah once more, the sheet unable to disguise the tragedy beneath. A leader silenced. A flame extinguished in a world desperate for light. "Elliot," I began, my voice thick, "do you think this was personal?" His reply came swiftly, quiet but firm. "Everything about this feels personal. And we're going to prove it." The determination in his tone sent a chill down my spine. Whatever we were up against, I knew Elliot wouldn't stop until the truth was laid bare, even if that truth was darker than we could imagine. The rhythmic cadence of marching boots faded as the protesters moved further down the street, but the tension lingering in the alley remained as sharp as ever. Elliot hadn't said a word since we returned to the crime scene after speaking with the jittery young woman. He hovered near the far wall, his back stiff, his head tilted just slightly as if tuning into something only he could hear. I'd seen him like this before, a man standing on the precipice of discovery, where a single misstep could scatter every carefully arranged clue like ashes in the wind. I leaned against the brick wall near the entrance, trying to make sense of the oppressive silence that pressed down on us. A few activists lingered nearby, their faces masks of anxiety and suspicion. Conversations carried in hushed tones, each voice sharpened by whispers of fear. Despite the warmth of the day, a shiver slid down my spine as I watched them, the gravity of what had just happened sinking deeper into my thoughts. Elliot's voice sliced through the quiet. "There's a connection here," he said, more to himself than to me, his fingers trailing along the grime-streaked bricks. "Something deliberate. Something planned." I pushed myself off the wall and approached him, careful not to disturb the space where Elijah Carter's body had lain. The witness mentioned a man. A stranger. That has to mean something. Elliot turned, his expression cool and collected as always, though I could see the sparks of curiosity crackling in his eyes. "It does," he replied, "but her description is vague. A man in dark clothes could be anyone." And yet, I countered, she was the only one brave enough to admit she saw something. That speaks volumes, doesn't it? Elliot allowed the corner of his mouth to lift slightly, an acknowledgement, though never a full smile. He stepped closer to the body's outline, marked by the faint scuffs where the white sheet had covered it. Kneeling, he ran his hand over the concrete, pausing as his fingers brushed against something small and metallic. He held it up between thumb and forefinger, a spent bullet casing. "Standard issue," he muttered. "Nothing custom. Likely a .38 caliber revolver. Local law enforcement uses them. Veterans use them. Hell, half the men in this town probably own one." His observation brought us no closer to the truth, but it laid out the breadth of suspects like a sprawling map. I frowned, scanning the alley's narrow exit, the one place where someone could have slipped away without a trace. A shadow moved near the far corner, startling me briefly before I realized it was just the officer standing guard. He looked far less confident than he had earlier, his gaze darting toward the crowd forming outside the alley. "I don't envy his position," I said, gesturing toward the officer. "Tensions in this town are already sky high. Throw in an activist's murder, and the powder keg might blow." Elliot stood and joined me, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Tensions are fuel," he remarked. "But the spark? That's always something personal." The notion hung heavy in the air, a theory with weight and merit, but no proof, at least not yet. My thoughts wandered back to Elijah, the fervor in his voice during every rally I'd attended, the fire in his eyes as he spoke of change and unity. It was hard to imagine that fire being extinguished by something so petty as jealousy or betrayal, yet Elliot's instincts rarely failed. We made our way toward the small crowd gathered at the alley's mouth. Several faces turned our way, apprehensive and untrusting, but one man caught my attention, a wiry figure with glasses and a notebook clenched tightly against his chest. He wasn't watching us so much as observing the entire scene, his sharp gaze darting between the activists, the officers, and the alley itself. Elliot noticed him too. "Reporter," he said under his breath. "Small time, judging by that notebook." As we approached, the man stiffened slightly, clutching his notebook as though it contained his very soul. Elliot didn't falter. "You're documenting this, I take it," he began, his tone steady but not unkind. The man blinked, nervous but intrigued. "I'm just trying to make sense of it all. There's a lot happening today." "No doubt," Elliot replied. "Do you mind sharing what you've seen?" The reporter hesitated, glancing toward the activists before speaking in a lowered tone. "I didn't see the murder, if that's what you're asking. But I've been following Elijah for weeks. He was polarizing, to say the least." Elliot's brow lifted faintly. "Polarizing?" The man nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Within the movement, I mean. He had admirers, sure, but also critics. Not everyone agreed with his methods or his ambitions." I stepped forward, feeling my pulse quicken. "Critics like who?" The reporter looked uncomfortable but resigned. "Other organizers, for one. I overheard arguments at a few meetings. Not everyone thought Elijah's approach was the right one. And then there were those outside the movement, of course. Business owners, local politicians, even some of his former allies." Elliot exchanged a brief glance with me, his expression unreadable. "Did Elijah mention receiving threats?" he asked. The reporter shifted uneasily. "He didn't talk about them openly, but I heard rumors. People said he'd been receiving anonymous letters, things like that. It's all speculation, though. Nothing concrete." Elliot thanked the man and stepped aside, motioning for me to follow. His silence as we walked back into the alley was deafening, his mind clearly dissecting every scrap of information we'd gathered. I waited for him to speak, knowing better than to interrupt his thoughts. "Finally," he said, "anonymous letters. Arguments within the movement. Former allies. A lot of threads," I remarked. "And a lot of distrust." He nodded, his gaze piercing as he looked toward the alley's far exit once more. "Distrust is the foundation of betrayal. And betrayal, that's where we start." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy shroud, the gravity of what lay ahead sinking deep into my chest. The murder of Elijah Carter wasn't just a tragedy, it was a storm waiting to break, and we were standing at its very center. The air was heavier now, thick with an oppressive tension that seemed to coil tighter the longer we lingered. As Elliot led the way out of the alley, his steps purposeful, I noticed the sun beginning to sink lower, gilding the tops of buildings in hues of orange and crimson. Dusk was coming, and with it, the shadows stretched and deepened as if conspiring to conceal the truths we sought. Our destination was the community center, a modest brick building that had become a hub for the movement. Its windows were plastered with posters demanding equality and justice, their bright colors faded under layers of time and weather. A sense of urgency clung to the place, and the footsteps of activists coming and going reverberated through the cracked pavement beneath us. As we approached the main doors, a woman standing outside turned to regard us warily. She couldn't have been more than 30, her face framed by dark curls pulled into a loose bun. She held a clipboard pressed to her chest, her eyes darting between us like a cornered rabbit. Elliot, ever the master of disarming tension, tipped his hat slightly and spoke in a calm, measured tone. "Miss, we're investigating Elijah Carter's death," he said. "Your cooperation could make all the difference." The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on the clipboard. She glanced toward the protesters milling about in the parking lot, as if gauging how much she should trust us. Finally, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her tone sharp but not hostile. "Plenty of men come here claiming they want to help, but all they do is dig up dirt or sow doubt." Elliot's expression didn't falter. "Because I'm not here to discredit anyone, miss." "Angela," she supplied reluctantly. "Angela Graves." "Well, Miss Graves," Elliot continued, his voice smooth as ever, "I'm here to find the truth, nothing more. And the truth is that someone wanted Elijah silenced. I intend to find out who and why." Angela studied him for a moment, her dark eyes probing his face as though testing the weight of his sincerity. At last, she nodded and gestured for us to follow her inside. The community center was a flurry of activity. The hum of voices filled the air, punctuated by the scrape of chairs and the occasional burst of laughter or heated debate. Angela led us through the main hall, where groups of men and women clustered together in animated discussion, their faces lit with equal parts determination and exhaustion. A large banner hung above the stage at the far end of the room, its bold letters proclaiming, "*A change is gonna come star." "He was supposed to speak here tonight," Angela said quietly, her gaze fixed on the banner. The whole town was waiting for it. Elliot didn't respond, but I saw the flicker of something, regret, maybe, in his eyes. He turned to her, his tone firm but not unkind. "We need to know about the last few days. Did Elijah seem different? Anxious? Distracted?" Angela frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of her clipboard. "He was always a little anxious before a big speech, but this time it was different. Like something was weighing on him." "Did he mention receiving threats?" Elliot asked. Her lips thinned, and she glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "He didn't talk about it much, but I saw him looking over his shoulder more than usual. He mentioned getting some letters, ugly stuff, calling him names, threatening to make him disappear." Her voice dropped lower. "I think he knew something was coming." Elliot's jaw tightened ever so slightly, and he jotted a note in his little black book. "And what about arguments? Disagreements within the movement?" Angela hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the clusters of activists in the hall. "There were always arguments," she admitted. "People don't always see eye to eye, even when they're fighting for the same thing. But Elijah, he had a way of making people listen. Of calming them down." "Not always, though," I interjected, earning a sharp glance from her. "People had disagreements with him too, didn't they? Anything serious?" Angela sighed, her shoulders sagging. "He butted heads with a few folks, mostly about strategy. Some thought he was moving too fast, taking too many risks. Others thought he wasn't doing enough. But I don't think anyone here wanted him dead." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Elliot scribbled another note before tucking his pen away and offering Angela a small nod. "Thank you. If you think of anything else, no matter how small, let us know." Angela nodded and turned to rejoin the activists, her steps slower now, as if weighed down by the conversation. Elliot and I exchanged a glance, unspoken questions passing between us as we stepped back outside. "You think she's hiding something?" I asked. "She's cautious," Elliot replied, his tone unreadable. Whether that's because of guilt or fear remains to be seen. We lingered outside the center for a moment, watching the last rays of sunlight dip below the horizon. The crowd of protesters had thinned, their chants fading into the growing darkness. Across the street, a pair of police officers leaned against their squad car, their faces unreadable beneath the flickering streetlight. "We need to see those letters," Elliot said, breaking the silence. "If they exist, they might tell us more about who wanted Elijah gone." "And if they don't?" I asked. Elliot's gaze hardened, his jaw set. "Then we'll have to dig deeper." The weight of his words settled over me as we turned to leave, the shadows of the night growing longer behind us. The truth we sought was out there, hidden among the tangled web of alliances and betrayals that surrounded Elijah Carter's life and death. And if we were going to find it, we would have to follow those threads wherever they led, even into the heart of darkness itself. The night had settled thickly over Jackson, Mississippi, as we retraced our steps toward the alley where Elijah Carter's lifeless body had been discovered. The community center felt miles away, though its echoes of passion and turmoil still clung to my thoughts. The faint hum of distant conversations floated down the empty streets, but the alley ahead was silent, an inkblot of darkness sprawled across the city's underbelly. Elliot led the way, his coat catching the occasional glint of streetlight as he moved with the fluid certainty of a predator stalking prey. The trench coat seemed like an extension of him, molding to his tall figure as though it knew its purpose was to shield a man who carried the weight of secrets. I followed closely, trying to match his pace while my thoughts raced ahead, seeking answers to questions that felt maddeningly elusive. The alley was unchanged from earlier, but somehow its eerie quiet felt more oppressive now. Elliot stopped halfway down, turning his gaze toward the spot where Elijah's body had lain. The patrolmen had left long ago, leaving only the outline of tragedy and the faint, bitter metallic scent of blood lingering in the air. I couldn't shake the image from my mind, the cruel contrast between Elijah's boldness and the cold finality of his fate. "You see it yet?" Elliot's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. It wasn't a question meant to be answered, not immediately. I glanced around the narrow space, scanning the walls, the ground, the shadows, trying to follow his lead. Elliot had a knack for making you feel simultaneously like an apprentice and an equal, pushing you to look deeper while never quite revealing how much he already knew. It was infuriating, and I had come to respect it. "Not yet," I admitted. "But something about the alley itself feels wrong." "Wrong how?" he asked, turning to look at me fully, his brow lifting ever so slightly. I paused, gathering my thoughts. "It's too perfect. Too cut off from view, too neatly aligned for an ambush. If Elijah came here alone, whoever followed him must have chosen this spot deliberately." Elliot nodded, his sharp gaze sweeping toward the far end of the alley. "Deliberate. That's the right word. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. Someone lured him here." The realization settled uneasily in my chest, and I found myself stepping closer to Elliot, as though the proximity to his confidence could steady my nerves. "But why here?" I asked. "Why not anywhere else?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched low, his long fingers brushing against the debris-laden ground with the precision of a surgeon. He held up a scrap of fabric, frayed and stained, and examined it closely before slipping it into his pocket without a word. "Someone knew the alley would hide them long enough to escape," he finally said. "And someone knew Elijah would come here." The implication was chilling. Whoever had killed Elijah wasn't just opportunistic, they were calculating, capable of reading his movements, anticipating his actions. The shadows in the alley seemed to grow darker, as though they, too, were listening to Elliot's deductions. We spent the next half hour combing the alley's length, searching for anything out of place, a cigarette butt, a shoe scuff, a hint of humanity buried beneath the grime. Elliot worked meticulously, his movements methodical and deliberate. I felt my own frustration growing as every new lead seemed to dissolve in my hands. "This clasp," Elliot said suddenly, pulling the silver necklace clasp he'd pocketed earlier into the light. "It's important." I frowned, stepping closer to him. "How so?" "Elijah didn't die clutching a medallion," he explained, his tone unwavering. "But someone wanted it gone. This clasp didn't just break, it was torn." "Torn?" I repeated, feeling my pulse quicken. "During a struggle?" Elliot nodded. "Most likely." The thought unsettled me further. The violence of the act suggested desperation, fear, but of what? I studied the clasp, its edges jagged against the faint glow of a streetlight, wondering what kind of secrets it might unlock. Elliot stood suddenly, his movements fluid despite the stiffness of long hours spent searching. He motioned for me to follow him toward the mouth of the alley, where the faint sound of footsteps now echoed. A man appeared out of the shadows, his lanky frame wrapped in a worn jacket, his eyes darting nervously toward us. Elliot didn't flinch, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had never lost control of a situation. "Looking for something, friend?" Elliot asked, his voice even but charged with authority. The man froze, his gaze shifting between us and the alley's depths. I wasn't doing anything," he stammered. "You're here, which means you're doing something," Elliot countered, his tone sharpening. "The question is, what?" The man hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. I could tell he was debating whether to bolt, but something in Elliot's expression pinned him in place. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I heard about Elijah," he admitted quietly. "He was a good man. I just wanted to see." "To see what?" Elliot pressed. "Where it happened," the man replied, his voice tinged with grief. "He deserved better." Elliot studied him carefully, his gaze probing the man's every twitch and breath. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sam," the man answered. "Sam Johnson." "You knew Elijah?" Elliot continued. Sam nodded, his eyes growing distant. "We work together sometimes. Not closely, but enough." "Enough for what?" Elliot asked. Sam hesitated again, his face tightening as though battling some inner turmoil. "Enough to know he had enemies," he said finally. "People who wanted him gone." Elliot's expression didn't change, but his posture grew slightly stiffer. "Who, specifically?" he asked. Sam shrugged, his movements jerky. "Could be anyone. Politicians. Business owners. Some folks in the movement didn't like his methods either." The words hung heavy in the air, echoing Angela Graves' earlier remarks. Elliot's gaze remained fixed on Sam, his mind clearly calculating the weight of the man's confession. "Do you know anything about the letters Elijah received?" Elliot asked. Sam stiffened, his eyes widening slightly. I heard rumors. People said he got them, but I never saw one myself." "Did he ever mention feeling watched?" Elliot continued, his tone measured but relentless. Sam nodded slowly. "Yeah." He said sometimes it felt like someone was following him. Watching him. Elliot stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Do you know who?" Sam's eyes darted toward the shadows again, his breathing shallow. "No," he muttered. "But whoever it was, I think they've been around for a while." The statement sent a shiver through me, and I couldn't help but glance toward the alley, as though expecting the shadows to come alive. Elliot's gaze never wavered, his mind dissecting every nuance of Sam's words. Finally, Elliot spoke again. "Thank you, Sam. If you think of anything else, you know where to find me." Sam nodded quickly, retreating into the darkness with hurried steps. I watched him go, a nagging unease twisting in my gut. "What do you think?" I asked. Elliot turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "I think we're looking for someone who's been watching Elijah for longer than any of us realized." The weight of his words settled over me, the chill of the night deepening as we turned to leave the alley once more. The threads of distrust were unraveling, but with every step forward, the shadows seemed to grow thicker. And in those shadows, I knew the answers waited, cold, cruel, and ready to strike. The sound of Elliot's heavy boots against the cracked pavement seemed sharper in the stillness of the early morning. The city, usually alive with voices and movement, lay subdued. It wasn't just the hour, it was the lingering grief and unease that trailed through Jackson like a ghost. I felt it in my chest, that hollow ache that was equal parts fear and frustration. Elliot didn't say much as we walked toward the small, nondescript boarding house that Sam Johnson had mentioned in passing before vanishing into the night. According to Sam, it was a place where Elijah had spent time, not as a resident but as a frequent visitor. A neutral ground, Sam had called it, where meetings had been held in secret, away from prying eyes and suspicious ears. Elliot's curiosity had been piqued, and where his curiosity led, I followed. The house sat at the end of a narrow, overgrown street. Its paint was peeling, and the windows were clouded with dust and grime. It might have once been charming, but time had eroded its character, leaving behind an air of neglect. The porch creaked under our weight as we approached, and Elliot raised a gloved hand to knock on the weathered door. The sound echoed hollowly, and for a moment, there was no response. I glanced at Elliot, who remained as still as stone, his patience unwavering. Just as I began to think no one would answer, the door creaked open, revealing a woman whose face was as lined and worn as the house itself. Her eyes, however, were sharp and alive, scrutinizing us with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice rough but steady. "Elliot Brooks," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm investigating Elijah Carter's death. I understand he spent time here." The woman's gaze flicked between us, her grip tightening on the doorframe. "You the law?" she asked warily. "No," Elliot replied. "But I am determined to find out who killed him." She studied him for a long moment before stepping back to let us inside. The air within the house was thick with the scent of old wood and mildew, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the worn furniture and faded wallpaper. The woman led us to a small sitting room, motioning for us to take a seat. "Name's Martha," she said as she settled into a chair across from us. "Elijah came here often. Said it was a good place to talk without folks getting suspicious." "What kind of conversations?" Elliot asked, leaning forward slightly. Martha shrugged. "Planning protests. Talking strategy. Sometimes just venting. He had a lot on his plate, you know?" I nodded, remembering the weight Elijah had carried so visibly, even in the moments he inspired hope. "Did he ever mention feeling threatened?" I asked. Martha hesitated, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. He didn't like to talk about it, but I could tell he was worried. He'd get this look in his eye, like he was always watching his back. Did he say who he was worried about? Elliot pressed. She shook her head. Not directly. But there were a couple of folks who came around here that he wasn't too happy with. Arguments, mostly. Heated ones. Elliot's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you remember their names? Martha hesitated again, her gaze dropping to her hands. One of them was a man named Caleb. Don't know his last name. The other was a woman, Angela. I heard you mention her name earlier. My breath caught in my throat. Angela Graves? She works at the community center. Martha nodded. That's her. She and Elijah didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. They argued plenty, but I never thought it was anything serious. Caleb, Elliot repeated, his tone thoughtful. What can you tell us about him? Not much, Martha admitted. He showed up a few times, usually late at night. Always seemed angry about something. Elijah didn't trust him, I could tell. But he kept letting him come back. Elliot stood, his movements brisk and purposeful. Thank you, Martha. You've been very helpful. Martha watched us with a mix of relief and unease as we left the house. The morning light was brighter now, casting long shadows across the empty street. I glanced at Elliot, whose expression was as unreadable as ever. You think Angela and Caleb are connected? I asked. Possibly, he replied. But we need more than a connection. We need proof. The determination in his voice was a steadying force, even as my mind raced with questions. Who was Caleb? What was his relationship with Elijah? And how did Angela fit into all of this? The threads of the mystery were tangling together, forming a web that only Elliot seemed capable of untangling. We spent the rest of the morning following leads, visiting the community center, speaking with activists, and piecing together fragments of conversations that hinted at deeper, hidden truths. The more we learned, the clearer it became that Elijah's death was not the result of a single act of violence, but the culmination of simmering tensions and hidden betrayals. By the time the sun was high in the sky, we found ourselves back at the community center. Angela was there, her clipboard in hand as she coordinated a meeting. She looked up as we approached, her expression shifting from surprise to guarded suspicion. Back so soon? She asked, her tone cautious. We have more questions, Elliot said simply. Angela sighed, setting her clipboard down. Fine. Ask away. What can you tell us about a man named Caleb? Elliot asked, his gaze steady. Angela's eyes widened slightly before narrowing. What about him? You knew him, Elliot pressed. And you argued with Elijah about him. Why? Angela hesitated, her hands clenching into fists. Caleb was difficult. He didn't agree with how we were handling things. He thought we should be more aggressive, take more risks. And Elijah disagreed, Elliot said. She nodded. Elijah believed in peaceful protest. Caleb thought it wasn't enough. They clashed a lot. Where is Caleb now? Elliot asked. Angela hesitated again, her gaze dropping to the ground. I don't know. He hasn't been around since Elijah's death. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Elliot's gaze remained fixed on her, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. "We'll need to find him," he said finally, his tone resolute. Angela nodded, her expression conflicted. "If he's involved, I hope you do." As we left the community center, the pieces of the puzzle began to align in my mind. Caleb, Angela, Elijah, 3 names, 3 threads that wove together into a tapestry of conflict and betrayal. But the picture was still incomplete, and the shadows that surrounded us seemed darker than ever. Elliot's steps quickened as we walked, his determination a force of nature that pulled me along in his wake. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies and secrets. And together, we would find it. The afternoon sun dipped low on the horizon, casting an amber glow over the streets of Jackson. The shadows stretched longer, pulling at the edges of buildings like dark omens, and the air was thick with a kind of weight that seemed almost alive. It made me uneasy, though I tried not to show it as we approached the dilapidated home where Caleb supposedly stayed. Elliot moved ahead, his steps quiet but deliberate, as if he were a predator stalking prey. His trench coat flared slightly with the wind, and his silhouette seemed larger than life against the backdrop of the peeling, sun-bleached house. I followed close behind, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes and the tension in my chest tighten with each step. The closer we got, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary dwelling. This place reeked of abandonment and secrets. The door was partially ajar, its hinges crooked and rusted. Elliot paused before it, tilting his head ever so slightly, listening for sounds within. All I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant chatter of children playing somewhere down the block. "Stay close," Elliot murmured, pushing the door open with a soft creak that made my stomach tighten further. The interior was dim, the faint light spilling through dusty windows doing little to illuminate the gloom. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, like the world had moved on while it stood frozen in time. The wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing cracked and mold-streaked walls beneath. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though disturbed by some unseen force. Elliot's sharp eyes scanned the room, his body still as stone. I stayed near the doorway, my own gaze darting nervously from shadow to shadow. There was an overwhelming sense of anticipation, like the air was charged with electricity and waiting to discharge in a crackling storm. "Someone's been here recently," Elliot said, his voice low but certain. He gestured toward a table near the far wall, where a plate of half-eaten food sat next to a crumpled cigarette pack. "These are fresh." "Caleb?" I asked, keeping my voice quiet. "Possibly," Elliot replied, though his tone carried an edge of doubt. "But he's not here now." We moved cautiously through the house, each step revealing more layers of decay and disarray. The floorboards creaked beneath us, and I half expected them to give way entirely under our weight. Elliot moved with practiced ease, his sharp eyes cataloguing every detail, the torn curtains, the shattered mirror propped against the wall, the faint scuff marks on the floor near the doorway. The kitchen was the next stop. It was small and cramped, the sink piled high with dishes encrusted in grime. A calendar hung crookedly on the wall, its pages stuck together and yellowed with age. Elliot examined the surface of the counter, running his fingers lightly over the scratches and stains as though searching for clues embedded in the very fabric of the place. "Anything?" I asked, my own unease growing as the silence stretched on. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened one of the cabinets, revealing a collection of mismatched dishes and cans of expired food. He frowned slightly, closing it again before turning to me. "Whoever's been here," he said, "they've been living like a ghost." I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could speak, a faint creaking sound echoed from upstairs. Both of us froze, the weight of the moment sinking in as the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Elliot's hand moved to his coat, where I knew he kept a small revolver hidden. He tilted his head toward the staircase, signaling for me to follow, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put. My heart hammered in my chest as we moved toward the narrow staircase, the wood groaning beneath our weight. The upper floor was even darker than the first, the windows covered with thick curtains that let in only the faintest slivers of light. The hallway stretched out before us, lined with closed doors that seemed to mock our presence with their silence. Elliot gestured toward the first door, and I nodded, stepping cautiously past him. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the handle, the cool metal sending a shiver up my spine. I turned it slowly, the door creaking open to reveal a room that was eerily empty save for a single chair placed in the center. "What do you think this is?" I whispered, stepping inside to get a closer look. Elliot followed, his expression unreadable as he examined the chair. Its wooden frame was scratched and worn, and the seat was stained with something that looked dark and ominous in the dim light. "A meeting place," he said finally. "Or something worse." The implications made my stomach churn, and I was grateful when Elliot motioned for us to move on. We checked the other rooms, each one offering its own strange sense of unease, an empty bed frame here, a shattered lamp there, and always the faint sense of something just out of reach. It was in the last room that we found it. A collection of papers scattered across the floor, their edges charred as though someone had tried to burn them but failed to finish the job. Elliot crouched to examine them, his gloved hands carefully sifting through the debris. "Letters," he said quietly, holding up one of the pages. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, the words scrawled in a hurried, almost panicked script. I stepped closer, peering over his shoulder as he read aloud, "You think you're safe, but you're wrong. We're always watching." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't help but glance toward the darkened window as though expecting to see someone watching us from the outside. "Threats," I said. "Just like Martha and Angela mentioned." Elliot nodded, his expression grim. And they weren't idle. He gathered the papers, tucking them into his coat before standing and gesturing for us to leave. The sense of foreboding that had hung over the house seemed to grow heavier as we descended the staircase, each creak of the wood beneath our feet feeling like a warning. Outside, the air was cooler, the breeze carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Elliot paused on the porch, his gaze scanning the street as though searching for something, or someone, hidden in the distance. "What now?" I asked, my voice tinged with both exhaustion and urgency. Elliot's expression hardened, his jaw set. "Now we find Caleb." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a heavy shroud. The shadows that surrounded Elijah Carter's death were growing darker, but with each step, we were drawing closer to the truth. And whatever that truth was, I knew it would be as painful as it was necessary. The evening air was cold against my skin, a sharp contrast to the searing tension that coursed through my veins. We had followed Caleb's trail to the edge of the city, into an industrial district marked by sprawling warehouses and tangled fencing, their rusted edges catching the faint glow of nearby streetlights. The sounds of distant machines and occasional voices echoed faintly in the stillness, punctuating the eerie silence that surrounded us. Elliot stood ahead, his figure nearly motionless save for the subtle turn of his head as he scanned the rows of buildings. His trench coat, as always, seemed to drape him in an aura of authority and purpose, as though the coat itself understood it was accompanying a man who would not be deterred. I stayed a step behind, my nerves taut and my senses heightened by the anticipation of whatever lay ahead. "He's here," Elliot murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the nearby machinery. How can you be sure? I whispered back, though I'd learned by now to trust his instincts. Elliot turned slightly, his sharp eyes catching the faint flicker of movement near one of the warehouse doors. He didn't answer, simply motioned for me to follow as he moved toward the building. His steps were silent, precise, as though the very air parted to let him pass unnoticed. The warehouse was imposing in its size, its corrugated metal walls towering over us like the ribs of some great iron beast. The faint glow of a single overhead bulb barely illuminated the entrance, casting shifting shadows across the ground. Elliot paused near the door, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge as he listened for any sound within. "Stay close," he instructed, his tone steady but charged with warning. I nodded, my throat dry as we stepped inside. The space beyond was vast and dimly lit, the shadows stretching and shifting as though alive. The faint scent of oil and metal hung in the air, mingling with the distant hum of machines. My pulse quickened as Elliot moved deeper into the cavernous space, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every surface. There was a sound ahead, a faint shuffle, almost imperceptible, but Elliot's focus snapped to it immediately. He motioned for me to stay back as he advanced, his steps still silent, his presence commanding in the dim light. I followed at a safe distance, my breath shallow as the sound grew louder. We rounded a corner, and there he was, Caleb. He stood near a stack of crates, his posture stiff, his movements jerky as though the weight of the moment threatened to overwhelm him. His face was pale in the faint light, his eyes wide and wild as they darted between Elliot and me. "Caleb," Elliot said, his tone calm but edged with authority. Caleb froze, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "What do you want?" he snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. "I want the truth," Elliot replied, his gaze unwavering. "The truth about Elijah Carter." Caleb's face twisted into a mix of anger and fear, his posture shifting as though he might bolt at any moment. "I didn't kill him," he spat, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't." Elliot stepped closer, his movement slow and deliberate. "But you know who did." Caleb hesitated, his breath coming in shallow gasps as his gaze flicked toward the exit. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between his desire to flee and the weight of the secrets he carried. "You don't understand," Caleb said finally, his voice trembling. "Elijah, he wasn't who you think he was." "What do you mean?" Elliot pressed. Caleb's gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders sagging. "He made enemies, all right? Not just with the movement, but with people who mattered. People who had power. And they wanted him gone," Elliot said, his tone even but firm. Caleb nodded slowly, his hands trembling. "There were threats. Letters. They said they'd do whatever it took to stop him." "And you didn't stop them," Elliot said, his voice hardening. Caleb looked up sharply, his face contorting with anger. "I couldn't." "You think I had a choice? You think I wanted this?" Elliot didn't flinch, his gaze steady as he continued. "You knew they'd kill him. You knew, and you let it happen." Caleb's breath hitched, his hands clenching tighter as he turned away, his shoulders shaking with emotion. I glanced at Elliot, whose expression remained cold and unwavering, his determination cutting through the tension like a blade. "Who sent the letters?" Elliot asked, his tone sharp and direct. Caleb hesitated again, his movements stiff as he glanced toward the crates behind him. "I don't know their names," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they've been watching him for months. Watching all of us. And they knew where he'd be," Elliot said, his voice laced with certainty. Caleb nodded, his gaze distant. They planned it. Every detail. They knew he'd come here alone. They knew what they had to do. I knew? Elliot pressed. What did you do? Caleb didn't answer immediately, his hands trembling as he stepped back, his gaze darting toward the shadows that surrounded us. I tried to warn him, he said finally, his voice breaking. I tried. Elliot's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. But you failed. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Caleb turned away, his shoulders slumping as though the burden of his guilt threatened to crush him entirely. I glanced at Elliot, whose expression remained cold and resolute, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. There was a sound behind us, a faint creak, almost imperceptible, and Elliot's posture shifted instantly. He turned, his sharp gaze snapping to the source of the noise as his hand moved toward his coat. A shadow emerged from the darkness, a figure cloaked in black, their movement silent and deliberate. The tension in the air thickened, the faint hum of the machinery growing louder as the figure stepped closer. Who are you? Elliot demanded, his tone sharp and commanding. The figure didn't answer immediately, their face obscured by the shadows. I felt my heart pound in my chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a vice. When they spoke, their voice was low and chilling. The truth doesn't matter anymore. Elliot's posture stiffened further, his gaze narrowing. It does to me. The figure stepped closer, their movement slow and deliberate. Then you're a fool. The words cut through the air, sharp and icy, as the figure disappeared back into the shadows. Elliot didn't hesitate, his movement swift and precise as he followed, his determination blazing like a beacon in the darkness. I followed as best I could, my breath catching in my throat as we pursued the figure deeper into the warehouse. The shadows seemed to close in around us, the faint sounds of footsteps echoing ahead like whispers in the void. And then, they were gone. The figure vanished into the darkness, leaving only the faint hum of the machinery and the oppressive weight of the unanswered questions. Elliot stopped, his posture tense as he scanned the space around us, his sharp eyes probing every corner for signs of movement. I stood beside him, my own gaze darting nervously as the silence stretched on. We're close, Elliot murmured finally, his voice steady but charged with urgency. Too close. I nodded, my throat dry as the shadows seemed to grow darker still. The truth was within reach, but with every step forward, the danger grew. And whatever lay ahead, I knew it would test us both. The air inside the warehouse was oppressive, thick with the scent of oil and rusted metal. The shadows, once distant and deceptive, now felt uncomfortably close, as though they were conspiring to swallow us whole. Elliot moved like a man chasing a phantom, his every step deliberate yet unyielding. His eyes, sharp and alert, darted between the darkened corners, searching for something, or someone, that he knew was just out of reach. I followed, the tension knotting my stomach tighter with every passing moment. The faint echoes of our footsteps on the concrete floor seemed deafening against the heavy silence of the space. The words of the cloaked figure still rang in my ears, their chilling weight sinking deeper into my thoughts. They weren't random threats, they were promises. Whoever was orchestrating this wanted us to know how close they always were, as if this game of shadows was theirs alone to control. What do you think they meant? I asked, my voice low but tight with urgency. About the truth not mattering anymore? Elliot didn't turn to look at me, his focus never wavering as he pressed further into the warehouse. It's not about the truth to them, he said. It's about control. Fear. His words hung heavy in the stale air, their meaning cutting through the tension like a blade. Elliot's movement slowed as we reached the far end of the warehouse, where a series of rusted lockers lined the wall. He paused, his gaze narrowing as he examined the faint scuff marks on the ground and the slightly ajar door of one of the lockers. Without a word, he stepped forward, his gloved hand gripping the edge of the locker door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed, as he pulled it open with a metallic creak. Inside, among the clutter of old tools and crumpled rags, was a small wooden box, its surface worn and scratched with age. Elliot reached for it, his movement slow and deliberate, as though expecting the box to explode in his hands. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the box, revealing its contents, a stack of photographs, neatly arranged and held together with a faded red ribbon. The edges of the photos were worn, as though they had been handled many times before. Elliot took the stack, his fingers flipping through them with practiced ease. The first photograph was of Elijah Carter, his strong, charismatic features captured mid-speech, his arm raised in defiance. The second showed him surrounded by a group of activists, their faces illuminated by the glow of a streetlight. But it was the third photograph that made my breath catch in my throat, a close-up of Elijah standing with his arm around another man, both of them laughing. The other man was Caleb. Elliot's expression darkened as he continued flipping through the photographs, each one revealing more of Elijah's relationships, his allies, and, if these images were any indication, his enemies. One photo showed Angela Graves standing near Elijah, her face turned away from the camera, her posture tense and guarded. Another showed a group of protesters, their faces partially obscured by the glare of the sun, but the anger in their expressions unmistakable. "What does this mean?" I asked, feeling the unease creep further into my chest. Elliot set the photos aside, reaching into the box once more. This time, he pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, its edges frayed with age. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the handwritten text. I could see the furrow in his brow deepen as he read, his expression a mask of concentration. "It's a list," he said finally, his voice low and clipped. "Names. Dates. Locations." I stepped closer, my eye scanning the list over his shoulder. The names were unfamiliar, but the dates corresponded to key moments in the civil rights movement, protests, marches, confrontations. Each entry was paired with a brief note, * surveillance, observation, intercept. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's their playbook," Elliot said, his tone cold. "This isn't just about Elijah. This is about everyone who stood with him. Everyone who might have taken his place." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the implications of his words. This wasn't just an act of violence, it was a calculated attempt to dismantle a movement, to sow fear and distrust among its ranks. Elliot placed the photos and the list back in the box, his movement swift and precise. "We need to get this out of here," he said. "It's evidence." As he closed the box and turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, stopping us both in our tracks. Elliot's hand moved to his coat, the glint of his revolver catching the faint light as he drew it. I followed his lead, my pulse pounding as the footsteps grew louder. From the shadows emerged a figure, their face obscured by the low brim of a hat. They moved with a deliberate slowness, their hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. As they stepped into the light, I recognized them immediately, Angela Graves. "What are you doing here?" Elliot demanded, his voice sharp. Angela hesitated, her gaze darting between us and the box in Elliot's hands. "I could ask you the same thing," she said, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "We're following the truth," Elliot replied. "Something you seem to know more about than you let on." Angela's jaw tightened, her posture shifting slightly as though preparing for a confrontation. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said, her voice low. "But you don't understand what you're dealing with. These people, they don't stop. They don't care about the movement or the truth. They care about control. And you're one of them?" Elliot pressed, his tone cutting. Angela flinched, her hand clenching into fists at her sides. "No," she said firmly. "But I know what they're capable of. I've seen it. And if you keep digging, they'll come for you too." Elliot didn't waver, his gaze locked on hers. "Let them." The weight of his words hung in the air, a challenge thrown into the void. Angela looked away, her shoulders sagging as though the fight had been drained from her. "You don't know what you're up against," she said softly. "Then tell us," I said, stepping forward. "Help us stop them." Angela's gaze met mine, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. For a moment, she seemed to consider it, her lips parting as though to speak. But before she could, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. "They're here," Angela whispered, her voice trembling. Elliot's posture shifted, his revolver steady in his hand as he turned toward the sound. My own heart raced as the shadows around us seemed to come alive, the faint glimmers of light catching on the edges of movement. And then they appeared, two figures, their faces obscured by masks, their movement swift and precise. They moved toward us without hesitation, their presence radiating menace. Elliot didn't wait, his revolver snapping up as he barked a single command, "Stop." The figures didn't comply. Instead, they moved closer, their intentions clear. Elliot fired once, the crack of the gunshot splitting the air and sending the sound echoing through the warehouse. The figures scattered, their movements quick and deliberate as they sought cover among the crates. "Run," Angela said urgently, her hand gripping my arm. "We have to get out of here." Elliot glanced at her, his jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, that he might stay and fight these faceless shadows alone. But then he nodded, his revolver still raised as he motioned for us to move. We ran, the sound of our footsteps pounding against the concrete floor as the shadows pursued us. The exit loomed ahead, a faint rectangle of light in the darkness, and I felt a surge of desperation propel me forward. As we burst through the door and into the night, the cold air hit me like a wave, sharp and bracing. Elliot was close behind, his revolver still in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. Angela followed, her breathing ragged but her determination unshaken. The warehouse loomed behind us, its shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. For a moment, we stood in silence, the weight of what we had discovered pressing heavily on us. And then Elliot spoke, his voice low but resolute. "This isn't over." I nodded, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The truth was out there, hidden among the shadows, and we were closer than ever to uncovering it. But the darkness had its own plans, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. The storm that had lingered at the edge of the horizon all evening finally broke as we fled the warehouse, the first drops of rain striking the pavement in rapid succession. They fell heavier by the second, cascading over us as we sprinted through the winding industrial streets. The weight of the wooden box Elliot carried seemed almost inconsequential compared to the greater burden we knew it contained. Every step was filled with urgency, each turn a gamble as the shadows of our pursuers threatened to emerge from the blackened streets at any moment. Elliot, ever composed under pressure, moved with deliberate purpose. His revolver was still clutched in his right hand, his left holding the box tight against his chest. Angela, trailing just behind us, cast frantic glances over her shoulder, her wet curls plastered to her face as the rain soaked through all of us. "There's a car ahead," Elliot said sharply, his voice cutting through the downpour. His eyes flicked to me, locking onto mine. "Get ready." I didn't need to ask what he meant. The parked sedan he had spotted sat like a beacon under a dim, flickering street lamp. As we closed the gap, Elliot holstered his gun, pulled a set of lockpicks from his coat, and moved to the driver's side door with practiced efficiency. In seconds, the lock gave way, and he opened the door, gesturing for Angela and me to get in. "Go," he barked, sliding in after me and slamming the door shut. The ignition gave a reluctant growl before the engine roared to life. Elliot shifted gears, the tires skidding slightly on the slick pavement before finding traction. The vehicle lurched forward, and we barreled into the night, leaving the warehouse district behind. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the adrenaline coursing through me like fire. Angela sat in the back seat, her eyes wide and unblinking as she clutched the seat in front of her. Elliot's hands were steady on the wheel, his jaw set in grim determination. "They won't stop," Angela said, her voice trembling. "Not until they get what they want." Elliot's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning the empty streets behind us. "Then we don't stop either," he said, his tone as hard as steel. "Not until we finish this." The rain hammered against the windshield, the wipers barely keeping up as Elliot guided the car through the city. My mind raced as I tried to piece together the threads of the mystery, the contents of the box, and the photographs flashing through my thoughts like ghosts. Caleb's words, Angela's warnings, the shadowy figures in the warehouse, it all pointed to something far bigger than Elijah's death. This was an assault on the very foundation of the movement, a campaign of fear designed to silence its leaders and dismantle its power. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "To the source," Elliot replied, his eyes never leaving the road. "The names, the dates, this list will lead us there." Angela shifted uneasily in her seat. "And then what? You think you can take them on alone?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but unyielding. "It's not about taking them on. It's about exposing them. The truth still matters." Her lips pressed into a thin line, doubt flickering in her eyes. "You don't know what they're capable of." Elliot's gaze met hers in the mirror, unwavering. "And they don't know what I'm capable of." The weight of his words silenced any further argument. The only sound was the roar of the rain and the hum of the engine as we sped through the city. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, despite the chaos surrounding us. Elliot had a way of inspiring that, a belief that no matter how dark things became, he would find a way to bring light to the truth. We arrived at a small, unassuming office building on the outskirts of downtown. The kind of place you'd never give a second glance, its faded sign and cracked windows blending into the rainy gloom. Elliot parked the car and turned to Angela. "Stay here," he said firmly. "We'll handle this." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "You think I'm just going to sit here while you—" "I need you alive," Elliot interrupted, his voice calm but commanding. "If something happens to us, you need to get this to someone who can use it. Someone who will keep it safe." The resolve in his tone left no room for argument. Angela nodded reluctantly, her hands gripping her knees as she watched us step out into the rain. The downpour had slowed, but the air was still heavy, the storm's presence lingering like a predator waiting to strike. Elliot and I moved quickly, the box clutched tightly in his hands as we approached the building. The door was unlocked, a detail that seemed too convenient, and we exchanged a brief glance before stepping inside. The dimly lit hallway was eerily quiet, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the worn carpet beneath us. We followed the trail of names and dates to a small office at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and Elliot pushed it open cautiously, his revolver raised. The room was empty, its walls lined with filing cabinets and shelves crammed with papers and folders. A single desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with documents and photographs. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice low. I moved to the desk, my eyes scanning the papers for anything that might provide answers. But as I reached for one of the folders, a sound behind us made me freeze. The faint click of a gun being cocked. "Don't move," a voice ordered, cold and sharp. We turned slowly, our hands raised in surrender as two figures stepped into the room. Their faces were obscured by masks, but their weapons were all too real, their barrels trained on us with unflinching precision. "Drop the gun," one of them demanded, motioning to Elliot's revolver. Elliot complied, lowering the weapon to the floor with deliberate slowness. The second figure stepped forward, their eyes narrowing as they spotted the box in Elliot's hands. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," they said, their voice laced with disdain. "That's usually how it starts," Elliot replied coolly. "But I'm quick to learn." The figures exchanged a glance, their postures tense. It was in that split second of distraction that Elliot struck, his movements a blur, as he lunged for the closest attacker. The fight was sudden and violent, the confined space erupting into chaos as fists and gunfire collided. I moved instinctively, grabbing the edge of the desk and flipping it toward the second figure, forcing them back. Papers and photographs scattered across the room as I joined the fray, the adrenaline fueling my every move. Elliot was relentless, his precision and strength overpowering his opponent with calculated force. The struggle ended as quickly as it had begun, the two attackers lying unconscious on the floor. Elliot retrieved his revolver and turned to me, his breathing heavy but controlled. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded, my chest heaving. "Yeah. You?" He didn't answer, his focus already shifting back to the box and the evidence scattered across the room. He moved quickly, gathering what he could before motioning for me to follow. "We need to move," he said. "Now." We left the building as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, the rain finally subsiding. Angela was waiting in the car, her relief evident as she saw us approach. "Did you get it?" she asked. Elliot nodded, his expression grim. "We got enough." As we drove away, the city stretched out before us, its streets bathed in the soft glow of morning. The fight wasn't over, but the first cracks in the facade of deception had been made. And in those cracks, the light of truth was beginning to shine through. The storm had passed, but the battle had just begun. Thank you for tuning into BookBound Audio. You've just heard Death in the Crossfire, a tale of secrets, sacrifice, and the enduring fight for justice. We hope you were as captivated as we were in bringing this story to life. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling tales. Stay tuned, because the next story promises to be just as unforgettable. Until then, take care, and we'll see you in the next chapter of BookBound Audio.